Now, chapter 18 of Theologico-Political treatise by Baruch Spinoza. In this chapter, he kind of talks about how the first Commonwealth kind of failed. It had a very good organization, separation of power, devolved units, all that, very patriotic citizens with a own army that came from its own citizens. But over time, this society kind of became corrupted and failed. And it failed in two ways. Number one, it failed in its resilience. And then, of course, at the end of it, it was conquered and destroyed. Of course, there was the rebuild of the second Commonwealth of the Jewish people. But it was not the same thing again. It was so different. He says the things that, when you read the Bible, I think I've read the Bible many years, maybe 20 years ago, when I was in somewhere where this was being discussed. And it was about the Jewish people demanding to have a king. If my memory serves me right, the conversation then was there was this influence from outside. They were looking at these other tribes around them and they had kings. They would go to battles and their kings would be leading them. For the Jewish people, yes, their king will lead them through I think what is the Ark of Covenant, is that what it's called? They used to carry it at the battlefield, just a symbolic that their king was with them at the battlefield. But they didn't feel like that was satisfying. So at some point they asked God, we need a king, and they got a king. Now, Baruch says that for them getting a king, that was the beginning of the end for the state, for the Commonwealth. It ceased operating in a smooth way, the way it used to operate before they adopted having kings. He says that before kings, there was peace for most part. In fact, he says that there were no civil war. There was no fighting really amongst the tribes of Israel. But once they got kings, that became a common thing. And to some extent, it's because people was fighting over this seat. And he also says that then it also became common for Israel to fight with their neighbors. They used not to fight so much with them unless they really needed to fight to protect themselves and their liberty. They used not to go out and fight their neighbors like that. But after the kings came in, now fighting became not just for protecting liberty or protecting themselves. It became like a source of glory for the kings. It was a way for the kings to put themselves out there and to seem great. So that caused a lot of fights. He also says before the kings, there were prophets, but these prophets were more of not incentivized to cause civil strife. But after the king came, the number of prophets exploded. There were so many prophets, and he says most of these prophets were creatures of the kings. And it makes sense. They were created for propaganda purposes. I will imagine it will be the same thing today for having media houses propped up by the government for disseminating propaganda. It was the same thing now. At this time, prophets were kind of like the people who were held very high up there. Their opinions were taken very serious, and societies could be swayed depending on messages coming from particular prophets. So he says, when the kings came along, this king set up so many of these prophets, and these prophets became a source of civil strife. And then he says, another thing that happened when kings came along, there was a push and pull between the high priest and the kings. And the high priest started taking administrative responsibilities. Now, the line between the two offices started becoming like a blurred. The high priest started feeling like they had a say in the political running of the state, and he says that became a problem because now sometimes the king will let the high priest guide the policy of the state because they wanted the support of the high priest for their own standing in the society, which in the end became and in fact, Baruch uses this as an illustration of why in any state the religious leaders should not be allowed to guide the public policy. They should just be there to be asked questions. Like, in fact, he says the first Commonwealth of the Jewish people was perfect in this because the high priest did not bring their opinion to the passage. Of course, they did, but the point is they did not try to influence how whatever they told the government was going to be used. For them, it was, and they used to wait. They did not come to tell them before they are asked. They used to wait for them to come ask and then tell them. And then whatever they did with that message, it was up to them. But he says when the kings came along, the high priest started becoming so involved in the running of the state, and that became a problem because now there was this people doing things for glory and for popularity or something like that. People trying to gain a favor with the public. It says that yeah, so it says prophets and high priests coming into influencing public policy. Those are some of the things he describes that weakened the first Commonwealth. Or not, yeah, the first Commonwealth after it had embraced kings. So that's what he talks about in chapter is it chapter 18? That's what talks about in chapter 18, about how the first Commonwealth started eroding.